She was 18 and cast out. No coat fit for winter, no family key, no place to return to, just a canvas backpack and $2 she had hidden from bus change for months. And with that $2, she bought a forgotten Gutta-Percha molding studio in Red Hook, Kings County, New York, erased from trade maps after 1958. Rain had opened a seam along the roof ridge. The rear brick wall leaned 2 inches toward the alley. The county had condemned it on June 17, 2022, with demolition penciled in for the coming winter. But inside the vulcanizing press beneath 50 pounds of iron wheel and threaded steel, a sealed hollow had waited untouched for decades with enough inside to alter the measure of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Mercer had been measuring pressure her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned which stair, complained which cupboard hinge, snapped loud enough to carry through a closed door, and how long to let the kitchen faucet run before anyone noticed she was crying. Her mother died when Wren was 9, leaving behind 2 wool dresses, a tin recipe box, and a silence her father never learned how to cross. Her father, Daniel, was not cruel. That became its own kind of problem. He answered conflict by lowering his eyes, folding newspapers into exact quarters, and allowing the strongest voice in the room to become the truth. The one adult who taught Wren another way was her grandfather, Elias Mercer, a retired electrical case molder who kept a narrow workshop behind a row house near the old Brooklyn waterfront. Every Saturday, he let her sort steel dies by depth scrape, cooled black compound from mold edges, and turn a little hand press until the threads began to sing. He showed her old Gutta-Percha fragments that softened in warm water lamp black, that stained the fingertips for days, and brass temperature gauges. At noon, they ate apples over the workbench. Before she left, he made her wipe every tool with an oiled rag and return it to the same nail. Heat reveals whether a thing was mixed honestly, he once told her. He meant rubber and sulfur, but Wren understood much later that he had been speaking about people too. Elias died when she was 15. Within a month, his rented workshop was emptied by the landlord, the notebooks carried away in unmarked boxes, and the small platinum sample frame he had once shown her disappeared. Wren kept only one bent awl she found under a shelf after the room had been cleared. Her stepmother, Celia, entered the house the following year with a soft voice and a habit of closing doors without sound. She rearranged drawers, counted grocery money aloud, and corrected Daniel. Nothing she did looked violent from the street. Inside the house, narrowed around Wren, by degrees, a missing key, a moved photograph, a cupboard shelf declared private. A question answered for her before she spoke. On October 14, 2022, Wren came home to find a velvet jewelry box open on the dining table. Celia stood beside it with one pearl earring in her palm and the other impossibly tucked into the side pocket of Wren's canvas backpack. Daniel sat 3 feet away, staring at the wood grain as if it required study. Wren removed the earring, placed it on the table, and waited for him to look up. He did not. Celia pointed toward the hallway. "Take your bag and leave before I call." 8 words. Daniel's wedding ring clicked once against his coffee cup. He still said nothing. Wren put in 2 shirts, Elias's bent awl, a toothbrush, and the thin gloves she used for autumn yard work. When she reached the front step, rain had begun in a gray line under the street lamp. She closed the door carefully behind her because carefulness was one thing the house had not managed to take. For 6 weeks she learned New York by the places that remained open late. She slept 2 nights in the waiting room near Port Authority before a guard moved her along, then on a plastic chair at a 24-hour laundromat in Sunset Park until the owner began locking the restroom. In Queens, she spent 3 nights beneath the overhang of a church on 31st Avenue, waking before dawn to fold her blanket into the backpack. She crossed back into Brooklyn and found warmth in subway cars between Stillwell Avenue and Manhattan, never staying asleep past the end of a line. Her money thinned with humiliating precision. $12.40 became $9.11, then $5.63. After bread, bananas, and a cup of soup she made last through an afternoon. She washed her socks in library sinks and dried them against restroom hand vents. By late November, she had exactly $2 left, the pair of worn bills she had kept flattened behind Elias's awl because spending them felt like cutting the final thread to the life before. On the 42nd day, she was at the Red Hook Branch Library warming her hands around a paper cup of tap water when she noticed a corkboard beside the local history shelves. One county disposal notice had been pinned crookedly beneath the others: condemned industrial structure, as is transfer tax, clearance required. Minimum bid $200. The address sat 3 bus stops and a long walk from where she was sitting. She read the notice twice, then copied the parcel number onto the back of an expired transit receipt. The sensible choice was food. She knew that. Instead, she touched the awl through the canvas of her bag and remembered a black compound becoming useful only after heat pressure and time. At closing, Wren walked out of the library with $2 a parcel number and a place that no one else wanted. The first bus carried Wren south beneath a sky the color of unpolished tin, then left her at a transfer stop where the next route had already ended for the evening. She walked the remaining 7 miles with the backpack tightening one shoulder and wind moving off the harbor hard enough to make her eyes water. At 28 degrees, the cold found the seams in her gloves before it found anything else. Near an old produce yard, she climbed through a loose sideboard into a hay storage barn, slept beneath a torn horse blanket, and woke before dawn with straw braided into her hair. Morning brought Brooklyn back around her in pieces. She passed Marino's Hardware with iron snow shovels chained outside Della Rosa Bakery, breathing warm yeast through a cracked door. Whitcomb Pharmacy beneath a faded green awning. Red Hook Shoe Repair with 3 boots displayed in the window, and Cormac's Cafe where someone inside was turning chairs upright one by one. Wren smelled coffee as she walked past and did not stop. The Kings County Clerk's Annex occupied the ground floor of a brown municipal building whose stone steps had been worn shallow in the middle. Wren entered at 8:17 with the parcel number folded inside her fist. The woman behind the property counter had silver hair clipped at the nape with a tortoiseshell barret and a brass nameplate that read Ruth Bell. She took the transit receipt, adjusted her glasses, and typed the parcel number into a terminal without asking why someone Wren's age wanted condemned industrial property. The printer gave a tired mechanical cough. Mrs. Bell read the first page, then the second. "You understand the roof is open?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no certified electrical service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the rear wall is under structural notice?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the city may require repairs immediately?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Bell looked over the rims of her glasses. "You have $2. Wren placed the bills on the counter. They were softened from being carried too long. Mrs. Bell flattened them beneath one palm, then disappeared through a side door. Wren heard drawers, a telephone receiver lifting the low exchange of 2 voices. 10 minutes later, clerk returned with a transfer form, a tax release sheet, and an old brass embossing stamp whose handle had gone dark from decades of hands. Initial here, full name there, date under the witness line. Wren wrote carefully. The stamp came down with a dense metallic click. Mrs. Bell turned the papers 90 degrees, pressed again, then slid a thin deed packet across the counter. Van Brunt South, right on Beard. Pass the old warehouse row and take the service lane after the second fenced lot. There's a brick chimney behind 2 walnut trees. If you reach the waterfront gate, you've gone too far. Wren gathered the papers, but Mrs. Bell had stopped looking at the form. Her finger rested on the signature. Mercer. Wren waited. The clerk removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with the edge of her cardigan. Was Elias Mercer family, my grandfather. For the first time that morning, Mrs. Bell leaned back. I knew that name before I knew this parcel number. She opened a lower drawer, brought out a thin cardboard index file, and searched through several yellowed cards. One carried the address Wren had just purchased. Another line, typed in fading violet ink, named a former operator associated with specialty molding, electrical insulation, and vulcanized decorative cases. Your grandfather came here years ago, Mrs. Bell said, not to buy it, to ask who owned it. Wren's hands tightened around the deed. When? Early 90s, perhaps. I was new. She tapped the card. He wanted access to old records, said someone in his family had worked there. We could not release the industrial archive without ownership consent, and the owner was already dead. Did he ever come back? No. The answers settled between them without explanation. Mrs. Bell replaced the card, then hesitated. He stood exactly where you are standing, kept grease under one thumbnail no matter how clean the rest of his hands were. Wren remembered the same black half-moon against Elias's skin. Mrs. Bell pushed the $2 bills into her cash drawer, but she did not close it. Buildings remember people strangely. Then she handed Wren the key. It was iron, longer than her palm and much older than the lock it supposedly opened. By 10, she was walking south on Van Brunt Street with the deed inside her jacket. Delivery trucks rolled past in bursts of diesel. Salt wind came between warehouses. At Beard Street, a man in a brown canvas coat was sweeping broken glass from a loading entrance while an old brindled dog watched from beside a milk crate. "You looking for the Mercer place?" he called. Wren stopped. She had not told him her name. He pointed with the broom toward the service lane. "Only building down there anyone still asks about." The dog rose, stiffly sniffed Wren's glove, then returned to the crate. Beyond the fence, 2 walnut trees stood above the roofs of abandoned sheds, their branches black against the pale sky. Between them appeared the chimney Mrs. Bell had described. The studio was smaller than Wren had imagined, roughly 26 feet wide and 42 deep, built of soot-darkened brick along the lower half and weathered timber above. Tar paper showed beneath missing roof shingles. One gutter hung loose like a bent arm. The brick chimney leaned only slightly, though mortar had fallen from several joints. Across the front, beneath peeling paint, she could still make out the ghost of an old sign, Mercer Specialty Molding. Wren stood beneath it until the wind pushed her forward. The key resisted twice. She lifted the door by its handle, taking weight off the warped frame, and turned again. The lock opened. Inside, the air was colder than outdoors and carried a sour rubber odor that had survived years of rain. Beneath it lay something mineral and burnt old sulfur caught in brick iron and wood. Her boots disturbed gray dust that tasted faintly bitter when it reached her mouth. The front room had once been an office. A counter leaned against one wall, swollen from damp, beside a shelf of ledgers reduced to curled brown paper. Wind entered through a broken upper pane with a thin whistling note. When Wren laid her palm against the interior brick, moisture chilled her fingers. She moved toward the rear. The smell changed first. Rust, stagnant water, old rubber. Then she saw the workroom. Steel molds lay open across 2 benches, some engraved with floral borders, mourning brooch ovals, cable collars, and narrow rectangular casings. Black Gutta-Percha fragments covered the floor like pieces of hardened bark. A copper heating vessel stood beneath a hood furred with corrosion. Against the far wall rose the vulcanizing press. It was nearly 7 feet high. Cast iron legs had been bolted directly into the floor. The central screw was thick as Wren's wrist, descending through a heavy crosshead above a scarred steel platen. A flywheel with 4 spokes projected from one side. She touched it and felt rust powder against her fingertips. She pushed. Nothing. She put both hands on the spoke and leaned her weight into it. Somewhere inside the press, metal answered with one low click. Wren became still. For a moment, the studio offered only the harbor wind, the loose window pane, and water ticking into a bucket someone had left decades before. She tried again. The wheel moved less than half an inch. That was enough. Near sunset, she found an old horsehair broom, cleared a rectangle of floor beside the press, and laid down her coat before sitting. Hunger made her stomach tighten, but the building had walls, a door she could lock from inside, and a roof that failed in only 2 visible places. Darkness gathered differently there. It did not arrive through headlights or closing stations. It settled into the corners and stayed. Wren ate half a stale roll a bakery worker had handed her while sweeping the sidewalk that afternoon. She drank water from a bottle filled at the clerk's office, wrapped her backpack beneath her head, and listened. A pipe ticked once. The rear wall gave a dry settling sound. The loose pane trembled. Far beyond the brick, a ship horn crossed the harbor. She smelled sulfur on her sleeve where she had leaned against the press. The odor brought Elias's workshop back for only a moment. Apples cut on newspaper, black dust beneath his nail. His hand guiding hers away from a hot die without scolding. Wren reached into the backpack and placed the bent awl beside her on the floor. Then she looked up at the enormous threaded screw disappearing into the press head above her. For the first time in 6 weeks, no one could tell her to move. In the darkest death and the harshest fire, a resilient nature vulcanizes itself into something that lasts. For 3 days, Wren worked outward from the smallest necessities. The hand pump behind the rear wall gave brown water for 12 strokes, then cleared enough to fill a pail. The outhouse at the lot's end leaned, but held. By the second night, she knew which pine board clicked near the office door, which one groaned beside the copper vessel, and which strip stayed silent if she crossed it heel first. On the 4th morning, she returned to Marino's hardware. Frank Marino had one eyebrow divided by a white scar and kept a carpenter's pencil behind his right ear. His store smelled of linseed oil, kerosene, and old cardboard. Wren put the deed on the counter and asked for the cheapest chimney brush he had. "You're living there. For now. Cash, not enough." Frank pulled a ruled ledger from beneath the register and wrote, "Mercer, Wren" on a fresh line. 30-day account, small one. "I can't promise 30 days. Then tell me before you disappear." He added a battered paperback home repair for old houses, its spine held with cloth tape. That part is free. She bought a 6-inch flue brush for $8.75 and 20 feet of fiberglass rod for $6.40 and leather gloves for $3.25. Furnace cement for $4.10 and 2 pounds of masonry nails for $1.60. Frank entered every figure carefully. Back at the studio, Wren read the chimney chapter twice before climbing. She fed the brush downward from the roof, adding rods one at a time. The flue resisted at 11 feet. Short vertical strokes loosened black creosote mortar crumbs and nesting grass that fell into the firebox like dry rain. She worked from above and below, rotating the rods a quarter turn after every 6 strokes. 4 hours later, her shoulders shook when she lifted her arms. She swept the debris into an old coal scuttle with folded roofing tin, wiped the hearth bricks, and pressed furnace cement into the largest failed joint. At dusk, she tested it. The first fire was 3 ledger pages, 6 dry splinters, and narrow pieces of pallet wood Frank had given her. Flame climbed toward the throat and straightened. Smoke went up. She waited 10 minutes before adding larger wood. Her first hot meal, there was a potato boiled in an enamel pot set inside the scrubbed copper vessel. She mashed it with cafe salt packets and ate on an overturned crate boots nearly touching the weak stove. The next morning, she inventoried only what seemed worth saving: 6 steel morning brooch dies etched with ivy and lilies. A brass thermometer marked to 350 degrees. A double-walled copper kettle. 3 locking vulcanizing trays. A hand-cranked shredder whose teeth still turned. Hardened Gutta-Percha rods. 2 tins of lampblack, and the press itself. The press bothered her. Elias had taught her that seized machines usually announced the reason if a person stopped forcing them. Wren began with sound. She tapped the left leg with a wooden file handle. Solid iron answered high and short. The right leg matched it. So did the crosshead platen and flywheel hub. Then she struck the thick housing beneath the central screw. The note changed. She tapped again. A duller answer came from the lower rear quadrant, as if the casting were hollow where it should have been solid. Wren cleaned the rust with a rag dampened in lamp oil. A circle emerged. Not a bolt head. A cedar disc blackened at the rim and fitted into the iron so precisely that corrosion had hidden the seam. She tested it before prying. Through a narrow drain hole below the casting, she pressed upward with Elias's awl. Something shifted inside. Paper against wood. 3 tiny holes ringed the disc, each filled with black wax and soot. Wren warmed the awl, softened the plugs, and exposed brass pins. She drew them with pliers, wrapped the cedar face in cloth, and turned. The disc moved 1/16 of an inch. Dry cedar and machine oil breathed from the opening. Behind it was a shallow cylindrical chamber bored into the hollow core beneath the press screw. Packages stood vertically inside, cushioned with old wool felt. Wren removed the first roll of oiled canvas. It held a steel trimming knife, a brass burnisher, and long-jawed tongs with wooden grips darkened by years of hands. The next parcel contained 6 blocks of raw, Gutta-Percha brown rather than black. Their surfaces had hardened, but near the stove they released a faint, earthy medicinal smell. A flat drafting envelope came next. Wren unfolded one linen sheet. It showed an insulated flywheel handle built around a hollow steel core, mica washers, and a removable hardwood sleeve meant to prevent burns during heated pressing. Beneath it was a formula in fountain pen Gutta-Percha, natural rubber sulfur lamp black with ratios and curing notes for unusual elasticity. Wrapped beside the drawings was a miniature platinum frame. Wren froze. Elias had shown it to her when she was 12 under a desk lamp, warning her to wash her hands before touching it. After his death, it had disappeared with the rest of his workshop. Now it rested in her palm. At the chamber's bottom sat a rectangular tin box. It was not locked. Wren carried it to the bench and lifted the lid. Inside were cloth bundles, folded currency, and paper-wrapped coin rolls. She opened them slowly. Morgan silver dollars. Barber half-dollars. Liberty head gold pieces and worn Indian head cents placed between larger coins so they would not strike one another. She counted once, then again. The total was $22,900. Not $23,000, not a round number. $22,900. She wrote it on the back page of Frank's repair book because her hands needed something exact to do. Beneath the last roll lay a split leather case. Inside was a military medal on a faded ribbon, its reverse carrying a Mercer family name and the year 1918. Then she saw the letter. The envelope was sealed. Her own name was not on it. Across the front in handwriting she knew, before fully admitting she knew. It were 5 words. For the one who finds this. Elias's hand. Wren placed the letter on the bench and did not open it. By then the windows had turned blue with evening. She returned the coins to their papers, the metal to its case, and the platinum frame to its tissue. She closed the tin box and set it beside the press. Then she locked the studio and walked to the harbor. The water was nearly black. Tug lights moved beyond the piers, their reflections breaking and joining again in the chop. Behind her, the studio held a fire, a deed, a hidden chamber, and a letter written by a dead man who had somehow expected another person to come. She watched the water until the first stars showed between the warehouse roofs. In the darkest death and the harshest fire, a resilient nature vulcanizes itself into something that lasts. Morning came with sleet clicking against the upper panes. Wren fed 2 narrow boards into the stove-boiled water and sat at the workbench without drinking it. In daylight, the envelope looked smaller than it had the night before. Elias's letters leaned forward slightly, the capital F made with a second downward stroke he had always added when labeling drawers. She ran one finger beside the writing, careful not to touch the ink. Then she broke the seal. My dear one, whoever you are. If you are reading this, you found the hollow beneath the press screw, which means you listened to the iron instead of forcing it. That is a beginning I can trust. I am writing in Brooklyn on March 3, 1994. Dr. Miriam Klein at Methodist Hospital has told me the scarring in my lungs is pulmonary fibrosis. She has been kind enough not to pretend that patience and medicine are the same thing. I have time to put certain things in order, but not enough to know who will eventually read this. Our line in this trade began with Thomas Mercer, born in 1843 in Newark, who crossed the river in 1869 and opened a molding bench near the Brooklyn waterfront. His daughter, Ada Mercer, born here in 1878, learned the dyes and presswork beside him and took over after his hands failed. Ada's son, Samuel Mercer, born in 1907, moved the family work toward electrical housings and cable insulation. Samuel's son was my father, Henry Mercer, born in 1931, and the Elias Henry Mercer came after him. 4 generations handled these tools before silence took the room. Ada married Arthur Vail in 1904. He went to France with the American Expeditionary Forces during the First World War and did not return. The medal in the leather case is his. Keep it with respect. It is not merchandise. The trade here closed on September 14, 1958. The press was cleaned, the boiler drained, and the door locked. More than 35 years have passed as I write this, and I have heard no wheel turn in this room. If you ever try the old compound, work slowly. Warm, raw Gutta-Percha, near 150 degrees Fahrenheit, before shredding it. For a flexible black mix use, 8 parts Gutta-Percha to 2 parts natural rubber, then add sulfur sparingly, no more than 1 part to 20 of the combined base. Lamp black should be kneaded in until the cut surface carries no gray streak. Once the die is filled, bring the press up gradually and hold the cure near 285 degrees for 25 minutes before you judge the piece. Never trust a hot molding. Let it cool under pressure. The money is not a prize. Most of it came from work, some from things I sold when I understood I would not reopen the shop myself. Use what is necessary to make the roof honest, the chimney safe, and the tools capable of work. Then leave something behind. Inheritance is not receiving what another person saved. It is doing enough careful work that someone after you receives a choice. The platinum frame was my father's pattern sample. The handle drawing is mine. The elastic formula came from Samuel and cost him 3 winters of failed batches. None of these things matter if they are only hidden again. If you arrived here because some other door closed, I will not ask who closed it. A workshop has no business judging the hands that enter it. It asks only whether they will learn. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Henry Mercer, Brooklyn, New York, March 3, Quinquillion. Wren reached the signature and continued staring at it until the stove settled with a small iron pop. Then she read the letter again. The second reading was slower. When she finished, she did not press the paper to her chest or speak into the empty room. She aligned the edges, found the 3 old creases, and folded it exactly as Elias had folded it 28 years before. One sentence had stayed with her: leave something behind. She turned the final sheet over. At the bottom, below the signature, Elias had drawn a small diagram of the rear doorway and written outside 3 paces from the threshold. Look for the iron ring beneath the walnut roots. Wren put on her coat. Sleet had become wet snow. Behind the studio, the nearer walnut tree lifted a root through the packed ground like a knuckle. 3 deliberate paces from the back step brought her to a shallow depression under dead leaves. She cleared them with her gloves. An iron ring lay flat in a round stone marker. She pulled. The marker did not open. It was not a lid at all, only a dressed stone sunk into the earth, its center carved with the same intertwined M and press wheel symbol she had seen faintly stamped on 2 of the steel dies. Wren brushed snow from the carving. Elias had not promised another treasure. He had given her a marker proof that the shop extended beyond the room and the machines that someone had taken time to set a sign where roots would slowly grow over it. She left it where it was. Inside again, Wren unwrapped the miniature platinum frame and set it on a fire brick near the stove. Not close enough to damage it, only close enough for the old metal to catch the flame. For several minutes it reflected almost nothing. Then the surface warmed, and a narrow line of amber moved around the tiny molded border. Wren remembered Elias lowering a similar piece into her 12-year-old hands and saying that metal should be held from underneath, never pinched by the ornament. She lifted it the same way now. By noon someone knocked. Frank Marino stood outside with a canvas sack of split kindling and pretended not to notice the letter on the bench. He carried the wood inside, looked once at the chimney draw, and said, "Better." An hour later, Doris Cormack from the cafe left a paper bag containing 2 boiled eggs, thick bread, and an apple. She refused the coins Wren tried to hand her. The man with the brindled dog came past near evening. His name was Ben Halley. Without being asked, he straightened the loose section of fence and wired it to the post before walking on. The next morning, Mrs. Bell appeared with an old county envelope containing photocopies of the property cards Elias had once requested. She set them beneath a dry brick and said only, "These belong closer to here." None of them gave Wren enough to solve the building. Each gave her enough for 1 more day. If you are watching this and someone once gave you one small kindness when you had very little to offer back, tell us what it was in the comments. Maybe it was a meal, a ride, a tool, a warm room, or simply a person who believed your word. Sometimes the smallest help becomes the thing a person remembers longest. That night, Wren put the tin box under the bench, slid Elias's letter into the deed packet, and arranged the burnisher trimming knife tongs, platinum frame, and bent awl beside her sleeping place. The storm moved over the harbor after midnight. She slept without waking. The first measurable snow came on December 3, 6 inches overnight, filling the service lane and laying a clean white edge along the studio's broken roof. Wren stood inside, listening to meltwater strike 2 metal pans, and understood that every other repair depended on stopping the sky. She read the roofing chapter in Frank's book 3 times. The roof measured roughly 28 by 44 feet over the eaves. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 16 squares of asphalt shingles, 4 rolls of 30-pound felt, and nearly 25 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. Frank corrected one multiplication, then said nothing about the total cost. When she returned for the first load, he placed a short-handled roofing hatchet on top of the bundles. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." The handle had been worn smooth near the throat. Bun Halley brought another man 2 mornings later. 71-year-old Walter Pike, who had roofed row houses before his knees forced him into retirement. Walter wore a red wool cap patched above one ear and refused the folded bills Wren offered him. Save it for shingles. For 11 days they worked whenever the surface was dry enough to stand on. Walter showed Wren how to sister a weakened rafter with straight dimensional lumber fastening beyond the rot rather than through it. They snapped chalk lines so each course rose true. He taught her to set a roofing nail in 3 strokes first to catch second to seat third to finish flush. On the 4th morning, Walter touched one nail head with his thumbnail. "That nail's proud." Wren reached for the hammer. "Pull it." She did. They stripped only what they could cover before dusk. Felt went down under weighted battens whenever harbor wind rose. Wren learned to keep the hatchet looped to her wrist to kneel uphill of loose bundles and never to trust frost that looked like dry timber. Her palms split beneath the gloves. Walter noticed and handed her a tin of salve without comment. By December 15, the final ridge cap was nailed down. That night, rain arrived instead of snow. Wren placed the 2 old pans in their usual places and waited. Nothing struck them. For the first time since she received the key, weather remained outside. January belonged to brick. The chimney that had drawn well enough for a small fire was not safe for a winter of steady heat. Frost had split several exterior faces into thin scales. Mortar beneath the crown powdered between Wren's fingers. Walter called it spalling and told her not to patch sound-looking brick over failure underneath. She worked downward from the top in short sections. Loose mortar came out with a plugging chisel never deeper than the joint could be refilled the same day. Frank found hydraulic lime and fireclay in the back room of the hardware store. For the hotter interior joints, Wren mixed 3 parts hydraulic lime mortar to 1 part fireclay, adding water slowly until the mixture held a ridge on the trowel without slumping. The work lasted 3 weeks. Most mornings stayed in the 20s Fahrenheit. Heavy gloves made the joints clumsy, so Wren removed them for pointing. Bare fingers gave her better control for 10 or 15 minutes before numbness made her set the trowel down. She warmed her hands beside the stove, then returned outside. The failed crown received a slight outward slope. She reset 2 bricks rather than disguising their cracks. Around the flue collar, she packed the mortar tightly and tooled each joint after the first surface sheen disappeared. On January 27th, Walter stood in the yard while Wren built the test fire. Paper first, then cedar, then 2 pieces of seasoned hardwood. Smoke rose through the chimney and continued vertically until the wind caught it above the walnut branches. Walter looked up for a long time. Clean draw. Wren stayed beside the fire until the bricks warmed evenly. The floorboards revealed themselves only after the roof and chimney stopped threatening them. They were white pine, wide and uneven, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails whose tops stood like small black flowers above years of dirt. Wren drove none of them below the surface. She lifted the worst bent nails, straightened what could be saved against an iron block, and reset them into their old holes. Frank rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. "You get 1 day at that price," he said. So began before sunrise. The first pass at 80 grit removed soot-old varnish and the gray fibers raised by years of damp. At 120, the grain became visible. At 220, the boards stopped catching the cotton rag she dragged over them as a test. Dust reached everywhere. It coated the window ledges, the press legs, her eyebrows, and the back of her tongue. She sealed the hidden chamber before starting and covered the steel dies with old flour sacks. By evening, the floor no longer looked black. The cleaned pine held the color of dark honey. Wren brushed on the first oil coat with the grain wiped every board after 20 minutes and repeated the process twice more over the following days. The final coat cured for 48 hours before she moved the benches back. As the oil settled, the wood deepened from honey toward mahogany around the oldest traffic paths. The marks did not disappear. Heel scars remained near the press. A narrow groove where some long-ago worker had stood returned under the light. One January morning, Wren woke before dawn and could not make herself pick up a tool. She boiled water. She opened the back door. At the harbor edge beyond the lot, a great blue heron stood in shallow water with its neck folded into its shoulders. Snow moved around its legs. Wren sat on the rear step for almost an hour. The bird waited. So did she. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned to the floor and rubbed the last dry patch by hand. February brought glass. There were 8 windows in the studio. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes patched with tape cardboard or nothing. The final window, high on the north wall, contained one wavy original pane whose corner bore an old glazier's scratched date, 1788. Wren left that pane untouched. For the others, she removed brittle putty with a narrow knife and softened stubborn sections carefully rather than levering against the sash. Frank sold her replacement glass and a tub of Dape 33 glazing putty. "Warm it in your hands first," he told her. She rolled each portion into a rope, pressed it firmly into the rabbet, set the glass, then pushed glazing points at intervals without forcing the pane. The finishing putty went in under pressure from the knife, each bevel drawn toward the glass, so rain would shed outward. The sash cords had become powder. Wren replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot before seating it into the counterweight pocket. The weights rose reluctantly at first. A drop of light machine oil returned silence to the pulleys. By the 7th window, she could remove a sash without setting down her tools. The 8th took nearly an afternoon. Its upper rail had warped enough to bind, and Wren planed only the swollen edge a few curls at a time, fitting and removing the sash until it moved without daylight showing around it. She was tying the final cord when a sound came from outside. Not metal, not traffic. A chickadee had landed on a bare walnut branch level with the window. Its body moved once with the wind-black cap sharp against the February sky. Wren held the sash still. The bird looked toward the bright room, then flew across the service lane. She lowered the window. It stopped exactly at the sill. No rattle, no whistle. The studio had 8 windows again. The walls came last because they had survived badly, but honestly. Near the chimney hole, patches of horsehair plaster had separated from hand-split oak lath. Wren tried 3 repairs in the same corner and watched all 3 fail. The first dried too quickly and cracked. The second sagged because she had made the mix too wet. The third looked sound until a tap with the wooden file handle returned a hollow answer. Frank disappeared into his stockroom and came back carrying an old burlap sack. "Horsehair. My father kept everything." Wren washed the hair, cut it short, and worked it into lime plaster by hand. The scratch coat went on first, pressed firmly through the oak lath and scored while green. The brown coat followed at 3/8 of an inch and cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The finish coat went on 1/8 inch thick, drawn with a steel trowel until the patched surface met the old wall without pretending to be new. She stood back from the repaired chimney corner. "These patches will hold another 100 years." The words surprised her because she had spoken them aloud. By then, the studio had begun attracting small acts of participation. Doris Cormack arrived twice a week, carrying paper bags folded twice at the top. She was a square-shouldered woman in her 60s, who always wore a white apron with one blue thread hanging from the pocket seam. Some mornings, the bags held biscuits and eggs. Other days, they contained soup in a glass jar or 2 slices of pie wrapped separately so the crust would not soften. Wren tried to pay her after the 3rd delivery. Doris pushed the money back across the bench. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." There were no candles in the old molding catalog, but neither woman corrected the sentence. A week later, a bicycle bell sounded in the service lane. Caleb Halley arrived on a red Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 19, long-armed, and wore a green knit cap pulled low over his ears. He began splitting the wet pile behind the studio before Wren had even asked his name. She carried money outside. He shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." That was all. He split enough wood for 3 weeks and stacked it bark side upward beneath the rear overhang. Before leaving, he sharpened the maul on Frank's old stone, wiped the steel clean, and rested it inside the back door. Reverend Boyd passed each morning shortly after 7. He was a thin man with a silver beard cut square beneath the chin, and a black felt hat that seemed older than his coat. He never entered unless invited. Sometimes he carried groceries for an elderly neighbor farther down Beard Street. Sometimes he simply walked. Each time he reached the studio, he tipped 2 fingers to the brim. One morning, Wren was on a ladder scraping loose paint from a lintel when he stopped below. "Keep these hands steady." 4 words. Then he continued toward the harbor. Wren remained on the ladder with the scraper in her hand until his footsteps were gone. Wren postponed the cellar until February 11. The door beneath the rear stairs had swollen into its frame, and Walter advised waiting until the worst winter damp had passed. When it finally opened, 7 granite steps descended into a room 12 feet by 15. Its walls fieldstone and its floor packed with fine mineral dust. She carried a lantern down first. At the center lay a dressed granite slab unlike the irregular surrounding stones. The same intertwined M and press-wheel craft mark had been carved into its face. Wren knelt. She ran one finger through the shallow groove. Then she stood. She did not lift it. Elias's letter had said enough about inheritance to make curiosity less important than procedure. If the slab belonged to the structure, she would understand it before disturbing it. On the way back up, the lantern caught something beneath the 3rd step, a corner of oak. Wren reached underneath and pulled out a small box wedged behind the granite riser. Its brass latch opened without resistance. Inside lay a key and a photograph. The key was 4 inches long. Its bow had been shaped into the same wheel and M emblem carved on the marker and cellar slab. The photograph was a tintype. A young woman stood outside the studio in summer light wearing a dark work dress with the sleeves rolled just below the elbow. One hand rested on a mold trimming knife. The face made Wren sit down on the step. Not identical, but close enough around the eyes and mouth that the resemblance required no imagination. She turned the plate over. On the back, written in faded ink, "Ada Mercer, daughter of Thomas Mercer, age 25, summer of 1903. Wren carried the tintype upstairs and placed it beside Elias's letter. The brass key went onto a small nail above the mantel. She did not know what it opened. For the first time, that did not trouble her. By March, the snow retreated into gray islands along the fences. The drainage creek beyond the warehouses ran loud after every thaw, and the walnut branches thickened with hanging catkins. Wren began opening the south windows for an hour at midday. The studio smelled less of wet brick and more of wood oil, lime, and iron warmed by sun. She did not begin full molding production that spring. The old formulas deserved more than enthusiasm. She chose 1 common silver coin from the cache and decided it would pay for raw material sulfur, lamp black, and enough natural rubber for small test batches. She would work in ounces, not pounds. Flat samples first, then simple dyes. Temperature, pressure, cure, time, cooling, behavior, every result written down. The large press could wait. The ornamental work could wait. The inheritance had survived decades without being rushed. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Wren completed the first object she was willing to call finished. It was not jewelry. It was a small, rectangular electrical case based on Samuel Mercer's early pattern, molded from a black Gutta-Percha compound she had adjusted across 14 failed trials. The final batch warmed at 150 degrees before shredding took lamp black without streaking and cured beneath the restored press for 25 minutes near 285 degrees. When the mold cooled, Wren released the pressure slowly. The case came free without tearing. Its corners held. The surface was dense matte and faintly warm beneath her thumb. She set it on the bench and left it there until morning before deciding that it was good. The studio, around it, no longer resembled the room she had entered with $2 and nowhere to sleep. The white pine floor carried a dark, even glow. 8 windows admitted winter light. The plaster remained slightly uneven where old work met new, and Wren preferred it that way. Steel sat cleaned and oiled on shallow shelves. The copper kettle had been polished only enough to use. Above the mantel hung the brass key. The vulcanizing press stood where it always had. Its flywheel now wore the insulated handle from Elias's drawing. One afternoon in late December, while pruning a dead limb from the older walnut tree, Wren noticed a narrow rectangle beneath a ridge of bark. Not bark, brass. It had been set into the trunk decades before and nearly swallowed by growth. She cleared the edges with Elias's bent awl. At the center of the plate was a keyway. Wren went inside. The brass key fitted without resistance. A quarter turn released a narrow iron compartment set deep behind the plate, not inside living wood, but within an old hollow that had grown around a protected metal sleeve. Inside was folded cloth wrapped in waxed paper. Wren carried it to the workbench before opening it. A 48-star American flag unfolded across the pine surface small enough to have been carried rather than flown from a building. Beneath it lay a note in Ada Mercer's handwriting dated October 7, 1918, while the Meuse-Argonne fighting continued in France. Arthur, Samuel is too young to understand where you have gone, so I tell him you are working far away. I keep the press running because orders for cable fittings have not stopped, and because the work steadies the day when the newspapers do not. If you return this flag returns to the house with you. If you do not, I will keep it here until someone in the family can hold it without asking war to become beautiful. Ada. Wren read the note once. Then she refolded the flag along the old creases. Arthur Vale's medal had remained in its leather case since the day she found it. The inscription and service records. Mrs. Bell later helped her trace showed that Arthur had died in France during the final weeks of the First World War. On November 11, 2024, Wren carried the medal to Cypress Hills National Cemetery. She did not organize a ceremony. She stood at the Veterans section on Armistice Day with Frank and Doris, a few paces behind her, held the medal in both hands for a while, then placed a small copied photograph of Ada beside Arthur's name in her family record book. The original medal returned to the studio. Some things could be honored without being surrendered. Wren was equally deliberate with the money. Over 2 years, she used 4 coins from the cash. One purchased the first molding materials. One helped buy the lime and fire clay when the chimney work exceeded Frank's credit. One paid part of a used temperature controller that allowed more exact curing. The fourth paid for archival sleeves, acid-free boxes, and a fire-resistant cabinet for the letters, tintype, formulas, medal, and flag. Everything else remained. She rewrapped the coins and currency listed them by denomination, enclosed copies of the inventory and deed, and returned the tin box to the cylindrical chamber beneath the press screw. On top, she placed a new envelope. For the next one. She did not seal the cedar disc permanently. That would have mistaken secrecy for stewardship. The shop reopened without a sign in the newspaper. Doris cleared one corner of the cafe corkboard and pinned up a white index card written in Wren's hand. Mercer, Specialty Molding, Small Historical Reproductions and Repair Work Inquiries by mail. Nothing more. 3 weeks passed before the first letter came. Then another. A museum technician needed 2 insulating collars made to old dimensions. A collector wanted a broken mourning frame corner reproduced. A university conservator asked whether Wren could provide flat compound samples for teaching. By spring, the mailing list had 43 names. Wren still worked slowly. Some orders she refused. Some she returned with a note explaining that a modern material would perform better. She never turned history into a claim of superiority. Old methods were worth preserving because they taught the hand what newer processes had hidden, not because every old method deserved resurrection. Caleb returned one April morning carrying a long object beneath a canvas tarp. He had grown broader through the shoulders and traded the Schwinn for a battered pickup, but he still wore the same green knit cap in cold weather. Made something. He removed the tarp. The sign was black walnut. Mercer Specialty Molding had been carved deeply across the first line. Beneath it, in slightly smaller letters, and daughters. Wren ran her fingertips over the final word. There were not always daughters. Caleb shrugged. There are now. She looked at him. Daughter. Planning ahead. The sign hung above the door that afternoon. Wren did not change it. Years earlier, Elias had written that inheritance meant leaving someone after you a choice. The sign made no promise about blood. It did not say whose daughters would come or whether they would carry the Mercer name. It only left the grammar open. That summer, Wren began another letter. She used heavy cream paper and Elias's fountain pen after replacing its hardened ink sac. She sat at the restored front counter while rain moved softly against all 8 windows. At the top, she wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped for nearly 10 minutes. She did not know who would find the letter. That was the point. She wrote about the roof first because roofs failed when ignored. She wrote about the chimney, the press, the cedar disc, and the temperature controller that ran 6 degrees high when first switched on. She explained where Frank's old repair book was kept and which glazing pane carried the scratched 1788 date. She wrote that Doris preferred payment in candles whether or not candles made sense. She wrote that Walter's roofing hatchet should never be sharpened past the original bevel. Then she wrote one sentence about arriving with nothing except a backpack, $2, and a bent awl. No names of enemies. No explanation of blame. That belonged to another house. She ended the technical notes with the rule Elias had passed to her, and she had proved by repetition never judge a molding while hot. Then, near the close, Wren wrote the sentence that had traveled through the work from one generation to another. In the darkest death and the harshest fire, a resilient nature vulcanizes itself into something that lasts. She read it once. She did not underline it. The letter went into the envelope marked for the next one, and returned to the chamber with the remaining cash. On cold evenings the shop settled into its own working sounds. The stove ticked. Cotton sash cords moved over restored pulleys. The press screw gave one low iron note when pressure came off after curing. Sometimes Wren stayed after dark and stood beneath Caleb's sign while harbor fog moved into the service lane. She no longer wondered whether she had been meant to find the place. Being meant for something was less useful than deciding to care for it once it was in your hands. The Gutta-Percha molding studio waits. It has always waited. At the county clerk's annex, Ruth Bell retired the following year. On her last afternoon, she cleared 3 drawers, boxed old forms, and removed 27 years of clipped notes from the edge of her monitor. At the back of the cash drawer, she found one of Wren's 2 worn dollar bills. She remembered the morning immediately. Ruth placed it in the shallow center drawer of the old clerk's desk instead of taking it home. The second bill remained there too, flattened beneath an obsolete property card and a brass stamp pad no one used anymore. $2. Still waiting.